Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to the stage and who will introduce our panel, ICS board member Jack Churchill.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Hope you've got your coffee at hand now. Welcome to Presidents and Prime Ministers. The conversations over the past day have been smart and spirited. On behalf of our board, thank you for your support and engagement. Without you, we could not put forward this strong program that we've seen. Thank you. Our first speaker needs little introduction to anyone who has watched the modern presidency unfold on television. Anne Compton spent more than 4 decades at ABC News and in 1974 became the first woman at television network assigned full-time to the White House. She traveled with 7 presidents, covered 10 presidential campaigns, and reported through pivotal moments from the end of the Cold War to 9/11. Her work has been recognized with Emmy, Peabody, and Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Silver Baton Awards, and brings the rare perspective of someone who has seen power up close and can explain what really happens when the cameras are rolling and when they are not. Joining her is Kate Anderson Brower, the journalist and best-selling author whose books have taken readers behind the scenes of American leadership. The Residents and First Women both reached the New York Times bestseller list, and her later works explored vice presidents, presidential power, and the human dynamics inside the executive branch. She covered the Obama White House for Bloomberg and has written for the New York Times, Vanity Fair, the Washington Post, and the Smithsonian. Her book, The Residents, inspired a Netflix series produced by Shonda Rhimes, and First Women is in development for a television show with Reese Witherspoon and Robin Wright. Kate's gift is translating institutions into story and pulling back the curtain on the people who live and work at the heart of government. Please join me in welcoming, as moderator, our ICS Deputy Director, Angela Ostrom, and our speakers, Anne Compton, Kate Anderson Brower, to the stage.
Thank you. I think I'm on. Am I on? I'm on? Okay, good. And because the room is a little echoey, I'm going to ask if someone shuts the door in the back so we don't have any problems with the audio. So, presidents and prime ministers, some of the favorite topics of this group. I don't know which side's going to win out in that Revolutionary War battle between presidents and prime ministers, who's the most favorite. But for this discussion today, we want to touch on a couple of topics. We have 2 experts in the field in journalism to give a reflection on this leadership role, what it means to the public, what it means to themselves, and how their role plays out. What does leadership style have to do with things? What is that special relationship that means so much to us between the US and UK, and how would you reflect on what you've seen in the front of the camera? How does the media impact it? What's going on behind the scenes? What are some of those personal dynamics that play into it? So think of some of these things as you're thinking for questions, as we have 2 celebrity journalists to help answer them at the end. So with that, I'm going to kick it off and say, for both of you, if you could consider, from the coverage you've had in your career over the many years and observing the White House, how do you see some fundamental differences between the US presidency and the prime ministership and their relationship folding out?
Well, I personally, just in covering the White House, and Anne is much more, she covered several presidents, I covered President Obama. There is a reverence for the presidency that you don't always see when you're watching C-SPAN and you see the parliament's questions and you see this kind of engagement between the prime minister and members of parliament that you don't always see with the president. I think there was, especially during the Obama administration, and I'd be curious to know if Anne saw a huge difference there between President Bush and President Obama. He was not the kind of president who would answer shouted questions. He was very professorial in his presentation, and he was, of course, protected by his press staff. And I think when I started covering the White House was really at the dawn of social media, where they could control the message and they could have Instagram accounts and tweet, and so it wasn't as much about working with the press. And so I think that there's something wonderful about the British Prime Minister position, because there is a level of informality that I never saw covering President Obama. That's probably different now because President Trump does answer shouted questions and loves to interact with the media, but that's my impression.
Angela, it's a wonderful question, and what strikes me, having covered American presidents, is they are prisoners of the calendar. Presidents can only take office, other than extraordinary circumstances, on January 20th, and 4 years later they have to walk off that stage, or if they're really eight years. So it's really hard to get rid of an American president, even if you are impeached twice. If the Senate doesn't meet and as a jury and convict you and take the office away from you, you remain in office. So American presidents are pretty secure in the time that they've got to govern. And I think that, above everything else, governs the difference between a constitutional democracy like ours and a prime minister who is subject to leading a party and who doesn't necessarily know how long that relationship is going to last based on party.
I think that's an interesting point, and you touched on that as well, Kate. It'd be nice to hear from both of you. I think everyone in here has probably heard or witnessed prime minister questions, or maybe you could even think of how viscerally shocking you found it as an American to watch the leader being questioned in that manner. And to look at the relationship of that leader where they aren't head of state in the UK like they are here. They're the political and the head of state here. Can you tell me a little bit about how that dynamic really has affected the role and what you've seen over the years?
Go ahead.
Well, you know, I wrote a book called Team of Five about the former presidents, and this question makes me think about that, because there have been points in history when there were no living presidents. And I think to me, it's the potential for power of the former presidents has really come to light during the Trump administration, and whether or not, you know, there are moments when they all come together, what kind of power do they have? And President George W. Bush was shocked when he found out that the Japanese prime minister said, you know, some former prime ministers go on to become legislators. And Bush said, no wonder you can't get anything done, because you have all of these formers undermining you. And this idea here that you know, when you leave the presidency, there is no place else for you to go. And I don't know off the top of my head what British prime ministers usually end up doing, but you know, there is this sense that there is this reverence for the position. And when they leave, they can do some damage. I mean, Jimmy Carter was somebody who came out and criticized peace plans, and you know, he wrote op-eds that were at odds with the several administrations. And so I think the idea that you as a former president can kind of every now and then assert yourself is really interesting, and I'm not sure if British prime ministers have the same level of power that former American presidents do.
Yeah. I am struck by how presidents and prime ministers are both totally, their relationships with each other and their relationships with the world and the relations with their voters at home, totally slave to what crises arise on their watch. What really dictates how a presidency is going? It's not what he promised in the campaign. It's not the legislative program he puts out. It's how the world can manage to have so many crises that really define your presidency. And that I think having seen relationships between American presidents and a series of British prime ministers, so many of those relationships grew and prospered because they were on the same page when world crises demanded the kind of unification and the kind of solid front from both countries and from the broader democratic communities.
Well, and Ann, that leads into a question I have for you, especially having witnessed so many presidents over the years. Which of them have you seen manage the relationship best with a prime minister? Which would you pick out from the crowd, and why would you say you chose them?
I'm tempted to say that the way George Bush was in Baghdad and at a press conference and with Prime Minister Maliki, and a journalist stood up and threw a shoe at President Bush, a sign of great disdain. And it was obviously a tense time in Baghdad. The president was there, and one shoe, and then another. It probably cemented the relationship between the two, and Maliki later it was suggested that he should give up the prime ministership and join the Iraqi national soccer team as a goalie, because he was the one who hit the shoe down and got it out of the president's face. Every president deals with with a prime minister with slightly unequal footing. The president is elected for that period of time, and the prime minister is probably much more subject to public opinion and the legislative parliamentary support. It's in a lot of ways, I think, a much more sensitive, much more vulnerable kind of position than an American president.
Well, so the duck and cover saved that relationship for them. As you think about the personalities behind presidents and prime minister, where have you seen that play out and have maybe either really noteworthy experiences or where you saw a real clash of personalities kind of come to play either in front of the camera or behind the scenes?
How?
Personalities between presidents and prime ministers.
The personalities are important. And I know on the part of American presidents, he has a large foreign policy staff and National Security Council staff in the White House, and they scrupulously study what the prime minister's challenges are, what the prime minister's history is. But then when the two get together, the personalities make such a difference. You know, you look back through some classic cases. Certainly, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher had a simpatico that was just kind of unmatched anywhere else. I think of the other ones that I kind of think that, well, George W. Bush and Tony Blair got along famously. The very first news conference they did together is when Prime Minister Blair came and visited Camp David, very informal, and President Bush at the news conference at the conclusion of their little summit said, "We use the same toothpaste, Colgate's." I mean, how intimate can you be with your relationships? It was interesting, the personalities just this week between President Trump and Prime Minister Carney of Canada, who arrived. Obviously, the last year has been somewhat fraught between the two countries, and tourism is down, and tariffs, but Prime Minister Carney arrived and said, "I'm wearing a red tie," and then he looked, and President Trump was wearing a bright blue one for a change. And President Trump said something about, the prime minister was listing all the places where President Trump has started a peace process all over the globe. And Trump interrupted and said, and U.S.-Canada, U.S.-Canada unification. And Prime Minister Carney said, "That wasn't where I was heading."
I think there's definitely personality clashes that we've seen in history and are seeing now. Kate, is there anything you can think of that stand out from you, especially from the Obama presidency with world leaders, that this role can kind of shed a light on the personality behind the image?
Well, I have a new book that I'm working on, and it has brought me, and I think Evan Thomas and Catherine were talking about this earlier, but I've been learning a lot about, I came prepared with a Churchill FDR little anecdote there.
This is the crowd.
Yes, this is the place to do it. So my new book has to do with the women who work in the outer oval. It comes out next year. So these are the personal secretaries to the president. And it's just been fascinating because Missy LeHand was FDR's longtime personal secretary, and looking at the power that these women behind the presidency hold. Most people don't think women in the West Wing are that powerful, and indeed they have been long before we had a female chief of staff. So I was reading through old books, and some of the most fascinating information I get, and the residence is proof of this, is from the housekeepers at the White House, who see and hear everything. And if you are interested in some behind-the-scene Roosevelt Churchill dynamics, Lillian Rogers Parks wrote a book called The Roosevelts, A Family in Turmoil. And she was a White House maid and seamstress. She lived in the White House, and she talks about the Churchill visits. And I write about first ladies as well. So I was very interested in the relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. A lot of people around the White House were afraid of Churchill, including Eleanor. She did not like his loudness and abruptness. She also did not like the fact that he drank so much, and she at one point confronted her husband about this. And it was interesting because FDR said, "I'm not the person with a family with an alcohol problem. You don't need to worry about it." Because, of course, Eleanor's father and brother struggled with alcoholism. So she did not like the kind of late night talking, the around the clock sort of running party that FDR and Churchill had, where they were discussing obviously very important issues. During World War II, when Churchill was visiting the White House, which he did 4 times between 1941 and 1945. He spent 113 days with President Roosevelt in that period. Lillian Rogers Parks, the White House maid, one of them, saw everything. And so she writes in the book about how Churchill would wear earplugs while he slept at the White House to muffle the noise of the men working on the underground bomb shelter day and night, which I thought was so interesting because we're talking about the East Wing ballroom now that President Trump is constructing. And the East Wing was really an afterthought. It was designed to cover up this bomb shelter. And then she also talks about small samples of Churchill's cigars that were injected into mice. If the mouse did not drop dead, the new box of cigars was safe to smoke. So, this is how they made sure. And so it's just a fascinating relationship. Churchill would walk around the halls of the second floor shouting, "Where is my man?" He was talking about FDR. And although he was up and around, he would tell Lillian, don't tell anybody I'm awake until 11 a.m. Don't tell anyone I'm around until 11 a.m. because he kept these kind of very strange hours. So obviously this relationship, famously between FDR and Churchill, was so important. And I think that, seeing the profound friendship between these two men and how it helped lead to the end of World War II is the ultimate story of a British prime minister and an American president, obviously. But there were many others. Jackie Kennedy and Harold Macmillan were very close, and I was surprised to learn that JFK and Prime Minister Macmillan were so close, and that their friendship brought about the 1963 limited nuclear test ban treaty. So I think that the dynamics, not only between the presidents, but also between the first ladies and the prime ministers, are fascinating. And I do think Eleanor revered and loved Churchill, but they were just two entirely different people.
I have to think the mouse story might be a new one for some of us. And not every state visit is that kind of fun slumber party that we can think about for FDR and Churchill. If we think about and Ann, you also mentioned this, the state visits, the conferences, the really choreographed events where you see the presidents and prime ministers, can you both give us a little bit of a reflection of what's actually going on behind the scenes and what are some really interesting things that you've learned from seeing some of that happen?
Well, there's no question that behind the scenes is where the most interesting moments and sometimes the toughest moments come for both the president and the visiting dignitary. But what the public sees, not only in the old days when it was just television pictures and coverage, now because so much goes out on social media, presidents like the current one will tweet or text little behind the scenes activity, that we get kind of a better one person's view of it. That I was fascinated in Evan Thomas's talk and Catherine's talk about how elaborately Churchill set up that ceremony, the church service on the ship, because the details of how these events are put together are so important. President Bush Bush 41 took President Mubarak of Egypt to a baseball game. Now, I'm not sure what that accomplished at that point, but there are the symbolic things that they do, whether the meeting is at Camp David, much more informal, still some coverage, but much more informal. Some of the biggest things that have been staged by presidents, when you think of the Camp David Accords, when Jimmy Carter brought both Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, and they were there, was it 13 days? I was down, we were all down in the village of Thurmont, waiting to hear what was going to happen. That kind of setting and the careful planning by a president can make all the difference in the world on whether you succeed. And instead of giving up after 7 or 8 days, President Carter kept them there and finally got a handshake. And in the middle of the night, I was actually the reporter who could watch the three of them get on a helicopter, fly down to the White House at 11 o'clock, midnight, and the next day out on the lawn, they did a handshake and everything. And that kind of perseverance and making sure that the host president has as much flexibility and as much power to get to the end point is really an art form.
Oh, no.
No, please add.
No, I think this is a small kind of addendum to what you're saying. I feel like there was always a bit of a sigh of relief when it was a British prime minister or a British, because when you covered President Obama, we would go every year to the UN, and there would be meetings at the Waldorf behind the scenes. And as members of the press, where Ann and I we're kept in a room adjacent, and they'll tell you when it's time to come in and maybe shout a question or hear how the meeting was. And I always felt that with a British prime minister, there was a level of familiarity and comfort that was never there was rarely there. I mean, there was certainly, I remember with Sarkozy of France, there was definitely like a friendship there between Obama and him. They had a kind of cute rapport. Yeah. But if there was anything that was having to do with Putin or any of America's more complicated relationships, there was a tension in the air. In fact, I remember Obama kind of brusquely leaving a meeting that involved a a Russian leader, and you just felt there's nothing like that alliance between the U.S. and the UK, and you felt it viscerally as a reporter.
Yeah. Speaking of the Russians, when President Bush first met President Putin, we were in Slovenia, and they went for a walk around the kind of castle where they were meeting and went back inside. And President Bush later said, I looked at Putin and I saw his soul. we wonder whatever happened to that moment because it sure didn't ever show itself again.
Well, and maybe in closing, and we're going to take some questions as well, so get ready to put us on the spot. When you think about what we should be looking for in this relationship moving forward, the presidents and the prime ministers, we certainly have a different kind of choreography, which you've both kind of talked about going on today. What are some things that you think are going to happen, or what are some things that you hope happen as we see these relationships unfold for the presidency?
I think one thing to watch for is the President of the United States is the executive, and he has a vast National Security Council staff, and of course he has the State Department. And when you look at the history of secretaries of state who worked for more than one president, there is an incredible bridge and a consistency in the various presidents' policies. Henry Kissinger was Richard Nixon's national security advisor. Nixon was weighted down with Watergate. His Secretary of State threw up his hands, Bill Rogers, and quit. So President Nixon made Henry Kissinger not only his national security advisor, but his Secretary of State. And think of what Kissinger was able to have the president do. He went, he spent weeks and weeks in the Middle East after the Middle East War, trying to calm that down. Kissinger told his press corps that he had a stomach bug and wasn't going to do something on a foreign trip, and made a secret trip to Beijing, where he began the process of opening the United States to China and the historic Nixon trip. And then under President Ford, Henry Kissinger, of course, had to handle all of the wind down of the Vietnam peace talk, the Paris peace talks, and the eventual American withdrawal from Vietnam. So very often it is the foreign policy structure of one administration into another that can really shape and color and improve what a single president can do with any given prime minister at any given point in time.
I don't think we'll know the answer to the real relationship between Trump and the current British Prime Minister. You know, there was Starmer. I always mispronounce his name. Sorry about that. It's such a fascinating, interesting name. I don't think we'll know that as a journalist and historian until we get the files from like the Trump library. And then you can go through someday, you can go through these letters and really see what the relationships are like. I mean, and we know that President Trump, you know, loves keeping letters like the one from Kim Jong-un that he likes to show reporters, which he showed me when I interviewed him, actually. He slid it across the desk, and his secretary, Madeleine Westerhout, came in, and I said, "Oh, can I take a photograph of this?" And she said, No, you can't take a photo of Kim Jong-un's letter to the president. But he's, you know, the idea that I'm sure President Trump has, obviously with the classified material that he took, he's saving every piece of correspondence, and he would love historians 50 to 100 years from now to know that he maintained that relationship with the British Prime Minister, and that there was a level of respect between them. So I just don't know if we'll know the real nature of these relationships for quite some time. And that is why the Macmillan correspondence with Jackie Kennedy was just, it's really, if you're interested in it, it's just astounding. And after JFK was assassinated, she wrote this letter to Prime Minister Macmillan at midnight in January 1964, and she confesses to him, "I become so bitter. You work together for the finest things in the finest years. Later on, when a series of disastrous presidents of the United States and prime ministers who are not like you will have botched up everything, people will say, 'Do you remember those days, how perfect they were?'" And that is about the US-UK relationship, the nuclear test ban treaty, which was JFK's, you know, the accomplishment he was most proud of, singularly. and the power of that relationship between an American president and a British prime minister that I don't think enough people recognize.
Do you think it's possible that sometimes we, even years later, don't have a clear understanding of something a prime minister and a president may have talked about? I'm thinking about August when Saddam Hussein's tanks rolled across the border into Kuwait. And where was Margaret Thatcher that day? Aspen, Colorado. She was at the Aspen Ideas Festival, and so was George Herbert Walker Bush. Very convenient. They both wrote in their memoirs that Margaret said, "Don't go wobbly on me. Don't go wobbly on us," because the president wanted to wait until the Russians signed on to a UN, eventually wanted to hold any American reaction until he made sure the Russians in the National Security Council would support the world opposition. Years later, then Vice President Dick Cheney said, "Oh, that never happened, that was an old wives' tale." Well, it's in both of their autobiographies. So I'm going to go with the presidential and prime minister version of it. But isn't that strange that in looking at history, historians like you have to look at all the evidence and make sure that some of it makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and you won't know for so long. I mean, people in the future will be able to look at what really went on between Donald Trump and these foreign leaders, and that's why the Smithsonian is so important. That's why presidential libraries are so important, because if anyone is interested in presidential history, I think the Miller Center at the University of Virginia has incredible oral histories where you're reading the top advisors' play-by-play of what was going on inside that administration.
I don't know whether prime ministers have prime minister libraries, but just recently, some of the American presidential libraries are withdrawing from the archives system. They no longer want federal dollars. They want to support themselves to maintain an independence from the federal government's oversight. And President Obama's library in Chicago will have no federal funds. And I believe I was told that the George H.W. Bush Library is going to be taken over by its foundation. And it's interesting that presidents might not trust their own current government to have the independence and to maintain the important records they've got if they are under any federal control.
Well, I know this crowd knows the importance of the historical record and seeks to preserve it in many ways, and certainly as it relates to Winston Churchill. So I want to turn it over to the audience for questions, and we have a roving mic. I see some coming heavy on this side of the room, so we'll get our lovely volunteer over to this area to start off with questions. Please make sure you have the mic before you talk.
Speaking of historical record, how difficult has the internet made the job of historians? I mean, everything now is electronic. You've got tweets, you've got blogs, you've got probably less written, even correspondence between major players. So how do you craft a record when you can't really get some of this stuff?
That is a terrific question. And just if I could start, because when I came to the White House, President Nixon had just left on the South Lawn. I came in on the North Lawn a couple of weeks later, and everything was done on film. Then, of course, we migrated to videotape. We could go live almost anywhere. And then I covered through presidents where Barack Obama finally got a BlackBerry, and then he got a phone. And of course, President Trump fired his first Secretary of State in a tweet while Rex Tillerson was over in Africa, I believe. The way to document and archive and preserve and properly report what a president or a prime minister or any other national leader is doing is really being eroded. So much of what President Trump is currently doing, he announces on Truth Social. I do not subscribe. I do not go on Truth. So I've almost stopped using all of the rest of it as well. But to have so much of that, our sources of information are so split, and of course, the public, both here and in foreign countries. The audience now sees a news media that is splintered. You get to pick your own comfort zone where you want to get your news, and it is a perilous time for those of us who want to accurately record what is happening with accuracy, with fact, and with immediacy.
That's absolutely true, of course. And I was heartened by the fact that when I went to the, for my new book that I was researching, I went to Fariel Govashiri, who was Obama's last personal secretary, and I interviewed her. And I asked her, you probably know her, she was wonderful, and I had a series of questions for her, and one of them are most of his records over email? Where can I find the correspondence? Will it be in the library? And she said, actually, he really did do a lot over the phone, a lot in person, and there were letters. And there is a concern that a lot of people have, to your point, about the presidential libraries becoming private, because then the idea is you could cherry pick what you want in there too. But and unfortunately, with the Obama library, historians are not going to be able to go in and actually look at the records. It's all going to be digitized, which is both good and bad because it's available to everyone. But to your point, I think this might be the last presidency where we're going to have a lot of, Trump is almost 80 years old, so I don't think yes, his social media is prolific, but he does do a lot of things in the old-fashioned, on the phone, letters, meetings, so there will be some transparency there. But the next president, we're moving further and further into everything being emails and then being, I think I understand why presidential libraries want to have separation from the federal government, but there's also, the Nixon Library, they had to redo the Watergate exhibit because there wasn't that much about Watergate in the library for a while, and they had to go through, and a historian who took over had to add to it. So presidents don't want their legacy to be the darkest days of their presidency. But as journalists and historians, we want to see, those are the things that are the most interesting, how they got through them. So I think it's okay for now, but it will get worse.
Yeah.
Good question right here. Right there. Nope. That way.
Yes. Is it on? Yes, it is. I applaud the idea of looking for transparency and immediacy, and this is from Ms. Compton. Given that, I wonder how you justify not looking at Truth Social when this is the most unfiltered and immediate channel to Trump's mind.
Oh, so the question is, how do you not look at Truth Social if it's the outlet to this president? Or do you have to be on Truth Social to look at it? That might be a question. Are you?
Yeah, you don't have to be on Truth Social to see what he's saying because it is, then reported in the news. I don't think that you necessarily have to subscribe to his specific website, but I suppose if you're looking, I don't really look at Twitter much or X much these days either. And also, I don't cover the day-to-day happenings at the White House. I think if you are a White House correspondent right now, you are on Truth Social, you are monitoring every single thing he says all the time. And it is an unfiltered, and a lot of people would say it's refreshing to have a president who is so unfiltered. I think that there is something to be said for that because in former White Houses, it hasn't been as transparent. He says what he thinks.
Overlooked recently, I think, is the fact that we have had now 2 presidents who are the first presidents who have ever been able to address the American people without ever going through the news media. Barack Obama was the first, not only with his tweets and but he had his own newscast on whitehouse.gov, the White House official website. The president not only had a photographer who went everywhere with him, but he had a videographer who would get behind the scenes pictures. And then every Friday morning on whitehouse.gov at 10 a.m., West Wing Week was published, a newscast about 5 minutes long of all the things the president chose to highlight that he had done that week. And it was voiced over by his deputy press secretary, Josh Earnest. And in it, you heard only of the wonderful things Barack Obama had done all week. The only other, Joe Biden didn't do this, but now Donald Trump puts out his own, he can go put out videos, he can put out all manner of information directly to the American people without that professional, hopefully ethical and responsible filter of the news media. And that will only...
Well, I would say...
That's okay. That's okay.
With
That's
respect to
okay.
our guests
I take no offense.
There's always great minds that think on each side of the media. And I think as we were talking about those who are picking and choosing what they're hearing, the same as you're saying, both presidents on both sides of the aisle have picked and chose what they give to the public to consume. And I think that's something to be mindful of when we think about the historical record. And I would be remiss without also pointing out that our own executive director, who was the historian for the State Department, was overseeing that foreign relations of the United States, those volumes that come out and show you where what was happening behind the scenes, which we don't get to see for some time from now. So I think as we think about the lens that we're seeing things now, we're not necessarily seeing everything, whether it's good or bad or on our side or not, or along with our views or not. We're not necessarily seeing everything that's going on behind the scenes with that diplomacy. So whatever your filter of the media is, I think that relationship is something for us to think about. It could, because it plays into the role of the leaders. We can see it in the prime ministers, and we can certainly see it in the presidents. And it wasn't just Nixon and Kennedy that were first, scrutinized by the media. And I think that Winston Churchill would say he was a very adept user of media and the word. And I think that's something that this group really admires. I think we had a question in the middle. I think we have time for maybe one more. I'm looking for the back crowd, but here's a question over here.
We've heard great examples of how a president and a prime minister have been able to get together on worldwide issues. We've had presidents who have been liberal, presidents have been conservative. And I'm sure we've had prime ministers the same way, the differences between it. Have we ever an example where we have a president this way and a prime minister the other way, where they had a difficult time getting together because one was a conservative and one was a liberal? Or is that something they've been able to work through easily?
Well, I think, Ann, you had a great example of maybe liberal and conservative in the traditional view of leaders in the US versus UK working well. And I don't know if we want to talk about, you've seen examples of it going well when there's that opposites attract, or if it is oil and water. I think with Tony Blair, you mentioned some maybe surprising relationships.
Yeah. Both have constituencies at home, both have their own kind of policies that they want to push forward. Maybe it's healthy every once in a while for an American president and a British prime minister or another prime minister to sit and have differences and talk about them in private and maybe even talk about them in public. We don't have to be in lockstep with all of our allies. The United States doesn't have to dominate every conversation. American presidents can learn from what other countries are doing, what their aspirations are. So I would hope that American presidents will listen as much as they will talk, especially when they are on the crucial issues that face all of Western democracy or all of global safety.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, these are all people, and it's about whether or not they get along on a personal level or not. You can disagree about issues, but if you have a respect for one another, they're able to work together. And it's just, again, I think the relationship, obviously, between the US and the UK has been historically so special and so sacred that there is and we are not that far away, I mean, from, World War II in the scheme of things, and people remember that alliance and how important it was. And so as long as we have a memory of that, and historians continue to write wonderful books, like Catherine and Evan, about that special relationship, and as long as American students learn about it in history classes around the country, then I think that this relationship will continue. And the personal dynamic is absolutely everything. And I think that President Trump and the current Prime Minister do have by all accounts, a positive personal working relationship. Whether they agree on every issue, is not really the question. It's whether or not they can talk to each other with common respect.
Absolutely. And right now, the whole world, the whole Western world, found some kind of commonality because they were all under threat, even if they weren't attacked on September 11th, 2001. The vulnerability is there, Western values, democracy being attacked that way. And there are so many fundamentals which leaders can find across continents, across oceans, that, again, and listening to each other and appreciating, as you said, with respect, the very, very valid points of view of an ally or even an adversary.
Well, I think that's a very positive commentary for us to end on. I hope you all join me in thanking our two guests for giving up their time and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.